It was an ordinary morning for Alexander, a successful businessman accustomed to the frantic pace of his life. He was on a business trip, like so many he had taken over the years, with his mind occupied by contracts, meetings, and strategies. His driver, a calm and discreet man named James, waited by the car, as always, ready for another day of urgent commitments. As Alexander climbed into the back seat of the car, he noticed something different. On James's wrist, an old-fashioned watch gleamed subtly in the morning sunlight. It was a classic model, with a worn leather strap and a simple yet elegant face. However, it wasn't the watch's appearance that caught Alexander's attention, but rather the overwhelming feeling of déjà vu that hit him like a punch to the gut. He recognized that watch. For a moment, the world around Alexander seemed to freeze. The sound of the city, the passing cars, the distant voices, everything became a blur as he stared at the watch on James's wrist. His mind was catapulted back to a time he had buried deep, along with the most painful memories of his life. His son, Ethan. The watch was identical to the one Alexander had given Ethan on his 12th birthday, just before everything changed, just before his son vanished without a trace. It was the last thing Alexander remembered seeing on Ethan, the boy smiling as he examined the watch on his wrist, pride and joy shining in his young eyes. Alexander felt a lump in his throat, a mix of anguish and hope that he didn't know how to process. How did James have that watch? Could it be the same one? And if it was, what did that mean? The idea that Ethan might be alive, that perhaps he had never really disappeared, was as tempting as it was terrifying. Trying to maintain his composure, Alexander leaned slightly forward, his voice wavering as he attempted to sound casual. "James, that watch you're wearing, where did you get it?" James looked at the watch, unaware of the tension in his employer's voice. "Oh, Mr. Alexander, it's a family heirloom. My grandfather gave it to me when I was young. I've had it for years." James's words only deepened Alexander's confusion. A family heirloom? That didn't make sense. He knew that model was rare, almost exclusive. How could there be more than one? As the car drove through the city streets, Alexander sank into his thoughts, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to answer. Meetings, business, everything felt irrelevant now. That watch, seemingly insignificant, had reopened a wound he thought had healed long ago. He needed answers. Something deep within him told him that James's watch was the key to unraveling the mystery that had haunted his life for so many years. Was Ethan trying to send him a message? Was he closer than Alexander ever imagined? As memories of Ethan flooded back, Alexander made a silent but resolute decision. He could no longer live in uncertainty, in the pain of a father who never knew his son's fate. It was time to confront the past, no matter what he might find. The discovery of that watch was no coincidence. It was the beginning of a journey that Alexander knew he had to take, a journey that could lead him to truths he had feared to uncover, but that he was now finally ready to face. The image of the watch wouldn't leave Alexander's mind. Deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen. That piece was not just an accessory. It was a portal to a past he believed was lost forever. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of unease, pushed him to take action. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. Sitting at his desk in the quiet office, he began to research. He knew he needed to find out more about the watch, its origins, and how James had come to possess it. Hours passed as he sifted through old files, collector websites, and any leads that could provide some clarity. Finally, he found something. In an obscure forum dedicated to collectors of rare watches, Alexander stumbled upon a mention of a watchmaker in a small town, almost forgotten on the map, who crafted custom models on order. The name of the watchmaker was Gabriel Morton, a man rumored to have made only a few of these watches, each with a unique design and a secret history. The town, called Hollow Creek, seemed like a place that time had forgotten. Small and isolated, surrounded by dense forests and mountains, Hollow Creek was the kind of place where strangers were viewed with suspicion, and secrets were kept under lock and key. The mention of the name sparked a distant memory in Alexander's mind. He had heard of that place before, though he couldn't pinpoint where. Perhaps in a lost conversation, an old article he read years ago, or maybe even something Ethan had told him. What mattered now was that Hollow Creek was connected to the watch, and possibly to the truth about his son. Without a second thought, Alexander decided he needed to go there. He informed James that he would need an urgent trip without revealing the true reason. During the journey, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to step into a different world, a world where the past and present intertwined in ways he didn't fully understand. When he finally arrived in Hollow Creek, Alexander was greeted by a town that seemed frozen in time. The narrow, winding streets were nearly deserted, and the few people he saw watched him with curious and cautious glances. There was something in the atmosphere of this place, something heavy and oppressive, as if the very walls of the houses were burdened with the memories of dark secrets. Alexander followed the directions he had found on the forum to a small watch shop located at the end of a cobblestone street. The building's facade was old but well-maintained, with a weathered sign that read, "Morton Sons, Watchmakers since 1923. When he entered, he was greeted by the soft sound of a bell and the unmistakable smell of polished wood and machine oil. Behind the counter, an elderly man with a piercing gaze looked up and regarded him with an expression that seemed both intrigued and suspicious. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice hoarse yet firm. "Are you enjoying the story so far? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this one." Alexander hesitated for a moment but knew he needed to be direct. "I'm looking for information about a watch, a rare model that I believe was made here many years ago." The man's gaze narrowed and he leaned slightly forward as if trying to assess Alexander more closely. "Many watches have passed through this shop. You need to be more specific." Alexander pulled out a photo of the watch from James's wrist, which he had discreetly taken in the car, and showed it to the man. "This one. Do you recognize it?" The man took the photo, scanning every detail with his eyes. Alexander saw a flicker of recognition pass over the watchmaker's face, but it was quickly replaced by an impassive expression. "Yes, I remember. That watch was made by my father many years ago. A special order from someone very influential at the time." Alexander felt his heart race. "Do you know who placed the order or how it ended up in my driver's hands?" The man hesitated, as if he were internally struggling with the decision to speak or not. "Things in Hollow Creek are complicated," he finally said. "Many stories here shouldn't be told. But if you are really determined to know, I suggest you seek out Mrs. Eleanor. She knows more about that watch than I could ever tell you." Alexander was intrigued. "And where can I find this Mrs. Eleanor?" The watchmaker gave an enigmatic smile. "She lives in a large house on top of the hill on the other side of town. But be careful, stranger. Sometimes the answers we seek are not the ones we want to hear." With those words, Alexander left the shop, his mind buzzing with new questions. Hollow Creek was much more than a small, forgotten town. It was a place filled with buried secrets, where the answers he sought might be closer than ever. But he also knew that the deeper he dug, the darker the truths he might uncover. Hollow Creek seemed even more isolated in the morning light, as if time itself had given up on keeping pace with it. Alexander woke up early, the unease gnawing at him. After the conversation in the watch shop, he knew he needed to go deeper, to explore the dark corners of that forgotten town where secrets seemed to hide in the shadows of the hills. The idea that his son might be alive, that the answers to his disappearance could be there, pushed him forward despite his growing fear. As he drove through the empty streets of Hollow Creek, Alexander felt a strange quietness around him. The old houses, with their worn facades, seemed to watch him like silent guardians of long-buried stories. The few residents he encountered either looked away or stared at him for brief moments, their expressions marked by a mix of curiosity and caution. It was as if the town were trying to drive him away, as if it knew that Alexander was about to unearth something that many would prefer to leave undisturbed. The road leading to the hill where Mrs. Eleanor lived was winding and shrouded in a fine mist that did not dissipate, even as the sun struggled to break through the clouds. The path seemed endless, each curve revealing more of the dense forest and empty fields surrounding the town, until finally the house appeared before him, a grand yet decaying structure that seemed to have resisted time with visible effort. When Alexander stopped the car in front of the house, he felt a chill run down his spine. The mansion was enveloped in an almost palpable silence, and the sensation that he was about to cross an invisible line made him even more anxious. He climbed the entrance steps and knocked on the door, hearing the echo reverberate through the depths of the house. Moments later, the door slowly opened, revealing an elderly but still imposing woman with eyes that seemed to pierce directly into Alexander's soul. "Mrs. Eleanor?" he asked, trying to hide the tension in his voice. The woman nodded, keeping her gaze fixed on him. "You are the stranger who is asking too many questions in Hollow Creek." Alexander took a deep breath. "I'm looking for answers about my son. He disappeared many years ago, and something tells me this place holds the answers I seek." Mrs. Eleanor remained silent for a moment, assessing Alexander with a look that seemed to measure his determination and sincerity. Then, without saying a word, she turned and gestured for him to follow her. The interior of the house was as gloomy as its facade suggested. The walls were covered with ancient, faded tapestries, and the air was heavy with the scent of mold and long-forgotten stories. She led him down a long hallway to a room that appeared to have been untouched for decades. In the center stood an unlit fireplace and an old armchair, next to a table covered with old papers and a dusty photo album. Eleanor approached the table, picking up the album with a trembling hand. "There is much about Hollow Creek that people don't know, and perhaps don't want to know," she said, opening the album to a specific page. Alexander leaned in to look at the photos. They were old images, faded by time, showing children and adults, likely residents of Hollow Creek from a very different era. But what captured his attention was a particular photo, a boy, about 10 years old, wearing a watch that Alexander recognized instantly. It was the same watch, and the boy, though younger, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Ethan. "This boy," Alexander began, feeling his voice falter. "Is he my son?" Eleanor closed the album, looking at Alexander with a somber expression. "He came here many years ago, brought by those who wanted to hide what they could not control. But Hollow Creek is not kind to strangers. Those who enter here carrying secrets rarely leave the same." Alexander felt the ground open beneath his feet. "So he was here? Is he still here?" Eleanor did not answer immediately, her expression remaining inscrutable. "Some say the spirit of the town holds him, that he was taken to places few can find. But yes, he was here. And what happened afterward depends on how far you're willing to go to find out." Her words were enigmatic, but Alexander knew she was giving him a warning. Hollow Creek was more than just a forgotten town. It was a place where time and memories intertwined, where those seeking the truth risked losing more than they found. But Alexander was determined. If there was a chance to find Ethan, he was willing to face whatever it took. The ghost town held his answers, and he wouldn't leave until he had them in hand. With these new clues in mind, he knew that the journey was just beginning. A journey that would lead him to confront not only the secrets of Hollow Creek, but also the ghosts that haunted his own heart. After leaving Mrs. Eleanor's house, Alexander felt himself delving deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and shadows. The town of Hollow Creek, with its suffocating atmosphere and taciturn inhabitants, seemed more alive than ever, as if every wall and corner held a story waiting to be discovered. And Alexander knew that the next piece of the puzzle awaited him in a small, inconspicuous pawn shop he had passed by unnoticed the night before. The pawn shop was at the edge of town, a place where sunlight seemed to fail to reach. The facade was simple, almost unassuming, with an old sign swaying in the wind that simply read, "Pawn Antiques." The door creaked when he opened it, as if no one had moved it in years. Upon entering, the scent of aged wood and worn leather enveloped him, mixed with the metallic odor of ancient items accumulating dust over the decades. The interior was small and cluttered, with shelves packed with all kinds of artifacts and trinkets, each with a forgotten story. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, hunched with age, almost hidden in the shadows. His small, piercing eyes sparkled when he noticed Alexander's entrance, as if he had been expecting him. "Can I help you?" The pawnbroker's voice was dry, almost a whisper but full of a sharp wit that belied his frail appearance. Alexander stepped forward, trying to control the anxiety in his voice. "I'm looking for information about an old watch. I believe it may have passed through your hands." The pawnbroker didn't move immediately, as if weighing the request. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Alexander's. "Many things pass through this shop, my dear. Things that people want to forget or hide." Alexander felt the weight of those words, but he knew he couldn't back down now. He took the photo of the watch once again and placed it on the counter. "This watch. I need to know where it came from and how it got here." The pawnbroker picked up the photo with trembling but skillful fingers. His eyes examined the object in the picture with a precision that only someone who had devoted their life to antiques could possess. "Ah, yes. I remember this watch." He returned the photo to Alexander and slowly stood up, walking to a shelf at the back of the shop. "It belonged to a young man who came to me many years ago. He was in trouble, desperate for money." Alexander felt his heart race. "Do you remember who that young man was? What did he say?" The pawnbroker returned with a small wooden chest, which he opened carefully. Inside, he pulled out an old notebook with a cracked leather cover and began to flip through it. He was one of those lost boys that Hollow Creek attracts. He wasn't the first, and he certainly wasn't the last. He traded the watch for a pittance, just enough to survive a few more days. He stopped at a specific page, studying something written there, and he said something that stuck with me. Something about being chased by people who were after him. A chill ran down Alexander's spine. Chased? Who were those people? The pawnbroker closed the notebook and looked directly into Alexander's eyes, his expression now serious and grim. Hollow Creek is not just a forgotten town. For many years, it has been a haven for activities that should never see the light of day. Smuggling, trafficking, and worse things I'd rather not mention. Those who came here fleeing were often hunted by those who wanted to silence them. Alexander's head began to spin. What had happened to his son? Did he run to Hollow Creek? Why? And from whom? "And do you believe my son?" Before he could finish the question, the pawnbroker interrupted him, his voice now more urgent. If he was fleeing, like many who came before him, then he might have been caught. But he paused, as if hesitating to continue. Alexander leaned forward, his expression pleading for answers. "But what?" The pawnbroker sighed, flipping through the notebook again. "But I've heard of a group. People who help these young men. They protect them from whoever is after them. A kind of local resistance. Maybe they managed to save your son." Alexander felt a spark of hope. "Do you know where I can find these people?" The pawnbroker looked at him for a long moment before answering. "There's a place in the mountains north of here. An old abandoned mine. They say that's where many of these young people were taken, hidden from their pursuers. If your son survived, maybe he was taken there." Alexander didn't know what to think. The idea that Ethan might be alive, hidden somewhere in the mountains, was both excruciating and hopeful. He knew the only way to find out the truth was to follow this new lead, no matter how dangerous it might be. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for telling me this." The pawnbroker merely nodded, a slow and solemn gesture. "Be careful, sir. In Hollow Creek, things are rarely what they seem, and those who seek the truth don't always like what they find." With those words echoing in his mind, Alexander left the pawn shop, knowing that his journey was far from over. With each step, he was getting closer to the truth and to his son's fate. And as much as fear haunted him, he knew he couldn't stop now. Not until he found Ethan, not until he finally understood what really happened in that forgotten town. The road to the abandoned house was winding and lined with trees whose branches intertwined above, creating a natural tunnel that filtered the sunlight into weak, flickering beams. Alexander drove in silence, his mind buzzing with questions and uncertainties. The pawnbroker's words still echoed in his thoughts. In Hollow Creek, Things are rarely what they seem. But he was determined to press on no matter what he encountered. If there was a chance to discover what happened to Ethan, he would go all the way. Finally, the house appeared before him, a dark and forgotten monolith nestled in the middle of the forest. The windows were broken, the doors had fallen off their hinges, and the facade was covered in moss and vines, as if nature itself was trying to hide it from the world. There was an aura of desolation surrounding the place, a feeling that time had stopped there, trapping dark secrets within its crumbling walls. Alexander parked the car and got out, the thick, humid air filling his lungs. He hesitated for a moment at the entrance, feeling the weight of what he was about to discover. But then, with a deep breath, he pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The interior of the house was covered in dust and cobwebs, the floor creaking under his feet. There were old pieces of furniture scattered around, in a state of decay, as if the former inhabitants had left in a hurry, abandoning everything behind. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he was treading in a place forgotten by everyone, except for the ghosts that still resided there. Guided by instinct, or perhaps by an invisible force that seemed to direct him, Alexander began to explore the house. He passed through rooms filled with debris and dark corridors until he reached a door that seemed different from the others, almost intact, as if it had been preserved for a specific purpose. When he opened it, he found a small room that resembled an improvised office, with an old desk and a metal filing cabinet. On the desk, there was a stack of old documents, and beside it, a wooden box containing yellowed photographs. Alexander approached, his heart racing, and began to sift through the papers. They were records, detailed listings of names, ages, and dates, each marked with enigmatic notes as if they were part of a dark catalog. When he turned one of the pages, he saw a name that made him stop. Ethan. His heart skipped a beat. There was his son's name, followed by information he didn't fully understand but which suggested something much more sinister than he ever imagined. The notes indicated transfers of location and mentions of guaranteed security and confirmed delivery that sent a chill through his body. Next, Alexander turned his attention to the box of photographs. As he picked them up, he began to tremble. The photos showed children and teenagers, all with expressions ranging from confusion to fear. They were in different locations, some in dark rooms, others outdoors, but all seemed to be under surveillance, as if they were prisoners. And then he saw a photo that paralyzed him. Ethan, clearly younger, sitting in a corner of a room he didn't recognize, wearing the same watch on his wrist. Alexander's emotions overflowed. The image of his son with eyes filled with fear and despair was more than he could bear. How could this have happened? And who were the people responsible for it? As Alexander continued to sift through the documents and photos, a larger picture began to form. The abandoned house was not just a refuge for those on the run. It was a central hub in a trafficking network, where children were taken from their families and sold like goods. The notes suggested that powerful people were involved, individuals who used Hollow Creek as a cover for their criminal activities. But there was something more. One last photo, found at the bottom of the box, showed a group of men, their faces obscured by shadows standing next to a black van. The pawnbroker was among them, younger but unmistakable. He had lied, or at least omitted the truth. He was not just an innocent bystander, but part of something much darker. Alexander felt a mix of anger and hopelessness. He was up against a network of people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. And now that he knew too much, his own life was at risk as well. But he couldn't and wouldn't stop. Ethan was out there somewhere, and he would do anything to find him. With the clues in hand, Alexander knew he needed to confront the pawnbroker again, and this time, he would demand the whole truth. He left the abandoned house, leaving behind a place filled with pain and darkness, but carrying with him a fierce determination to bring his son back and expose those who had destroyed so many lives. What had once seemed like a desperate search for answers was now turning into a quest for justice. Alexander was ready to face anything or anyone that stood in his way. Night was beginning to fall over Hollow Creek, casting long, sinister shadows across the landscape as Alexander returned to the abandoned house, this time with a new determination burning in his chest. He was no longer just seeking answers. He was on a mission, driven by the anger and desperation of a father who knew his son was in danger. Every step he took toward that forgotten house was a step toward the truth, a truth he now knew was darker than anything he had imagined. When Alexander entered the house, the silence was almost suffocating. He walked through the same dusty corridors he had explored before, but this time, something felt different. He sensed a presence, a feeling that he was no longer alone. Trusting his instincts, Alexander headed for the room where he had found the documents and photos. The door was ajar, as if someone were waiting for him. Upon entering the room, Alexander stopped abruptly. In the corner of the room, illuminated only by the dim light coming through the broken windows, stood a man. He seemed to blend into the scenery, his dark, worn clothes merging with the shadows. However, his eyes shone brightly, watching Alexander's every move with calculated attention. Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the palpable tension in the air. The man did not answer immediately. He continued to stare at Alexander as if assessing the situation, deciding whether to speak or maintain the silence he had kept for so long. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and filled with a weariness that went beyond age. "I am the Guardian," he said, the words coming slowly, as if they carried a meaning that Alexander did not yet understand. "Guardian of what?" Alexander pressed, taking a step forward, his eyes locked on the man's. The man sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of a responsibility that seemed unbearable. "Guardian of the secrets, of the sins of Hollow Creek. I'm here to ensure that what happened here doesn't leave these walls, that the dead can rest, and that the living carry their burdens in silence." Alexander felt his anger rising inside him. "You knew what was happening here. You knew they were trafficking children, including my son. How could you stay silent?" The Guardian averted his gaze as if he couldn't bear the weight of the accusation. "I had no choice. No one here did. Hollow Creek was corrupted long ago, and those who opposed it disappeared. I tried to save some, but there were too many, and those behind it were powerful, untouchable." Alexander couldn't contain his outrage. "Ethan, my son, what do you know about him? Where is he?" The Guardian hesitated, but upon seeing the anguish in Alexander's eyes, he decided it was time to break the silence he had kept for so long. "Your son was brought here, like many others. He was just a child, but there was something in him, a strength that the others didn't have. They took him to the mine, where no one dares to go. It's where they kept those who had not yet been sold, those who had a worse fate awaiting them." The mention of the mine sent a chill down Alexander's spine. The mine mentioned by the pawnbroker was the heart of the darkness surrounding Hollow Creek. "Is he still alive?" Alexander's voice was almost a whisper, filled with both hope and fear. The Guardian looked at him, his tired eyes full of a determination that Alexander hadn't noticed before. "I don't know for sure, but if he is alive, that's where you'll find him. The mine is where all the secrets of Hollow Creek are buried. If you enter, you must be prepared to face whatever you find." Alexander felt a wave of despair, but also a renewed determination. The mine was his next stop, the place where all the clues pointed, the place where he might finally find Ethan, or at least discover his fate. The Guardian stepped forward, extending his hand to Alexander as if he wanted to give him something more than just words. "Be careful. Those who control Hollow Creek, they know you're here, and they won't stop until they silence you, just like they have with so many others." Alexander took the Guardian's hand, feeling the firmness of the grip. There was a silent understanding between them, a recognition that they were both fighting against something much bigger than themselves. "Thank you," Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I won't give up until I find my son." With that, he released the Guardian's hand and turned to leave the house. The path to the mine lay ahead of him, and he knew that every step would take him deeper into the secrets of Hollow Creek. But no matter what awaited him in the depths, Alexander was ready to face it. After all, his son's life was at stake, and he wouldn't let Hollow Creek take him away again. As Alexander left the Guardian's house, his mind was buzzing with thoughts. But he also had a clear new direction: the mine. The darkness surrounding Hollow Creek seemed to close in around him as he approached his goal, but he was determined to push forward. Each step brought him closer to the truth about what had happened to his son, and he knew he couldn't stop now, not after coming this far. As he walked toward his car, something on the ground caught his attention. Between the floorboards of the porch, he saw a piece of old, time-yellowed paper, partially covered in dirt. Kneeling down, he carefully pulled the paper out, realizing it was an ancient letter, nearly disintegrating at his touch. The faded ink was barely legible, but Alexander knew it could be crucial. He got into the car, and in the dim light inside, began to read the letter, trying to decipher the faded words. It was a hurriedly written letter, likely left there as a last resort, perhaps in the hope that someone would find it one day. The sender was not mentioned, but the content was disturbingly clear. The letter spoke of an enigmatic figure known only as the Protector, someone who had worked in the shadows to save the children brought to Hollow Creek. The author of the letter explained that the Protector was an insider, someone who knew the ins and outs of the criminal operation, but secretly opposed what was happening. Apparently, this figure had helped several children escape, hiding them in safe places away from the clutches of those who hunted them. The words of the letter were filled with fear and urgency, but also with hope. There was a mention of a hideout in the mine, a place where the Protector supposedly took some of the children, including, and Alexander felt his heart skip a beat upon reading this, a boy described as determined and strong, even in the face of fear. There was no doubt in his mind. That boy was Ethan. The letter continued, mentioning that the Protector had a contact inside the mine, someone who helped care for the children while they waited for the right moment to escape. But the last part of the letter was stained and illegible, as if time or water had washed away what could have been the final key to finding this contact. Still, Alexander felt he was closer than ever. As he held the letter in his hands, Alexander realized that the crucial piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The mine, which he had feared as a place of darkness and danger, now represented the last hope of finding his son. If the Protector was still there, or if the contact mentioned in the letter was still alive, there was a real chance that Ethan could be found, saved from the terrible fate that so many others had faced. Alexander's determination solidified. He had no time to waste. He needed to go to the mine, find the hideout mentioned in the letter, and above all, discover the identity of this Protector, who even in the darkness of Hollow Creek had risked everything to save those who could not save themselves. Carefully tucking the letter into his pocket, Alexander started the car and drove toward the mountains. The mine awaited him, a place of ancient mysteries and present dangers, but also a place where the truth, and possibly his son, were waiting to be discovered. He knew that the journey to the mine would be fraught with risks, but now, with the crucial clue in hand, he was more determined than ever. Ethan was close, and Alexander would do whatever it took to bring him back. The road leading to the neighboring town was lonely and surrounded by vast fields, where the wind seemed to whisper ancient stories. Alexander drove in silence, his mind focused on the letter he had found. The clues within it led him to a place he hadn't expected, an old orphanage far from Hollow Creek, hidden in a town that almost no one remembered. The idea that Ethan might have been taken there, away from the chaos and darkness haunting Hollow Creek, ignited a spark of hope in his chest. When he finally arrived in the town, he was greeted by an environment that seemed to have stopped in time. The small town was quiet, with little traffic on the streets and old houses that, while well-maintained, showed signs of wear. The people passing by appeared suspicious, casting furtive glances in Alexander's direction, as if his presence disturbed the silent order of the place. The orphanage stood at the end of a street lined with tall trees, their leaves softly whispering in the wind. The building was imposing yet aged, with high windows and dirty stained glass that reflected the light of the setting sun. There was something melancholic about the appearance of the structure, as if it held memories of better times that had long been forgotten. Alexander got out of the car and approached the rusted iron gates surrounding the orphanage. Pushing them open, the shrill sound echoed through the empty courtyard, announcing his arrival. He moved cautiously, feeling the weight of the silence around him. The front door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone who had long since left. Upon entering, he was greeted by a large, cold foyer, with old furniture covered in dusty sheets and the distant sound of footsteps he couldn't identify. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the entire building was caught between the past and the present, holding within its walls the stories of the children who once ran there. "Can I help you?" The voice, though soft, broke the silence and made Alexander turn abruptly. In front of him stood an elderly woman, with a gentle but weary gaze. She wore a simple, clean dress, and her gray hair was pulled back in a bun. There was something in her eyes that suggested she knew more than she let on. I'm looking for someone," Alexander began, choosing his words carefully. "My son disappeared many years ago. I recently discovered that he may have been brought here. I need to know if you can help me." The woman studied him for a long moment before sighing, as if she had been expecting this conversation for a long time. "Many children have passed through this orphanage over the years. Some arrived here by means I would rather not know. But we did our best to care for them, to give them a chance." Alexander felt a tightening in his heart. "His name is Ethan. He would have been brought here many years ago, probably under unusual circumstances." The woman nodded slowly, as if recalling something. "Yes, I remember a boy. He arrived here on a stormy night, brought by a man who said he was in great danger. We took him in, of course, like we did with all the children who needed us. But there was something different about him. He was scared, but also determined. There was a strength in him that I had never seen before." Her words hit Alexander like a bolt of lightning. "Ethan, is he still here?" The woman shook her head sadly. "No. He stayed with us for a while, but it wasn't safe for him here. The man who brought him said there were people looking for him, dangerous people. So, we took him to a safer place, far from here." Alexander felt hope slip away a bit, but he still clung to the remaining thread. "Do you know where he was taken?" The woman hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the consequences of what she was about to say. "There's a place, a refuge, away from the towns and people. A place where children like Ethan were taken to hide. Few people know its location, and even fewer would dare to go there. But if he's somewhere safe, it's there." She stepped closer to Alexander and placed a gentle hand on his arm, her eyes showing a deep understanding of the pain he felt. "I can't promise that he is there, but if you head towards the mountains to the north, you'll find an isolated cabin near a lake. It's a hard place to reach, but that's where many of our protected children were taken." Alexander felt a mix of relief and fear. The refuge the woman mentioned was both a last hope and a formidable challenge, but he knew he had no choice. If there was the slightest chance of finding Ethan, he had to go there. The woman released his arm, and Alexander thanked her sincerely, feeling the weight of the moment. He turned to leave, but before he went, she spoke one last time. "I pray that you find him, and that this journey brings you peace. But remember, sometimes the answers we seek come with new questions." With those words echoing in his mind, Alexander left the orphanage and returned to his car. The last part of his journey awaited him. A journey that would take him to the forgotten refuge in the mountains and, hopefully, to a reunion with his son. The road to the orphanage had taken him to a part of his life that Alexander thought he had left behind. The journey, filled with secrets and dark revelations, had prepared him for anything, or so he believed. However, as he crossed the gates of the orphanage, the feeling that the past was about to confront him directly was inescapable. The orphanage was located in a remote area, surrounded by dense forests that seemed to be silent guardians of the stories held within its walls. The building, old and imposing, exuded an aura of mystery and timelessness, as if the place itself had been waiting for him, anticipating the right moment to reveal its secrets. Upon entering, Alexander was greeted by a long, dark hallway, adorned with old portraits that seemed to watch his every step. The sound of his shoes echoed softly against the wooden floor, creating a solitary melody that accompanied him as he made his way to the main office. There, sitting behind a heavy wooden desk, was an elderly man whose tired, knowledgeable eyes fixed on Alexander with a mix of curiosity and recognition. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice hoarse yet filled with a gentle authority. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm looking for information about my son. He disappeared many years ago and I believe he may have passed through here." The man studied Alexander for a moment before slowly rising and walking over to a shelf filled with files and old books. "Many children have passed through this orphanage over the years, all brought here under complicated and painful circumstances. If your son was here, there may be records that can help us find him." With those words, the man pulled out a large, worn registry book and opened it on the desk. The yellowed pages were filled with tight handwriting, names, and dates that told the stories of every child who had come through that place. Alexander watched anxiously as the man flipped through the pages, each turn bringing him closer to a possible answer. Finally, the man stopped and ran his finger along a line of text before lifting his gaze to Alexander. "Here it is. Ethan. He arrived here, under very difficult circumstances, but his stay was short. He was adopted by another family and taken far from here." Alexander felt his heart tighten. The word adopted reverberated in his mind, opening up a new set of questions. Who adopted him? Where did they take him? Before the man could respond, the office door slowly opened, revealing an elderly woman dressed in a nun's habit. Her eyes were gentle, but carried the weight of many years of service and guarded secrets. She entered the room quietly, looking directly at Alexander as if she recognized him from somewhere deep within herself. "I am Sister Agnes," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I took care of Ethan while he was here. He was a special boy, full of life and hope, despite everything he had been through. I knew we needed to find a safe home for him." Alexander stepped forward, anxiety growing in his chest. "What happened to him? Where did he go?" Sister Agnes sighed, feeling the pain in Alexander's words. "A foreign family adopted him. They took him to Europe, far away from everything he knew. It was hard for him at first, but I believe it was for the best. They loved him as if he were their own son." Alexander stood frozen for a moment, her words hitting him like a punch. Ethan was alive, but an ocean away, on a different continent, with a new family. The joy of knowing his son was safe mixed with the despair of realizing how far away he now was. "Do you know how I can find him? How can I contact this family?" Alexander's voice trembled with a mix of urgency and hope. Sister Agnes looked at the elderly man behind the desk, who nodded slightly before turning his attention back to Alexander. "They left contact information in the hopes that someone would come looking for him one day. I can give that to you, but you need to understand that Ethan may not remember you. He was very young when he was taken. His life has changed completely." Alexander felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but he held them back. "It doesn't matter. I need to see him. I need to know that he is okay." Sister Agnes nodded and handed Alexander a piece of paper with the address and contact information for Ethan's adoptive family. "Go to him," she said gently. "He deserves to know the truth, and you deserve to find him again." With the paper firmly in his hand, Alexander thanked Sister Agnes and the elderly man, his heart now filled with a new purpose. The search for Ethan was not over, but it was about to enter its most crucial phase. He now knew where his son was, and nothing would stop him from crossing the ocean to find him. As he left the orphanage, Alexander felt a renewed sense of hope in his heart. The journey to Europe would be long and filled with challenges, but he was prepared for anything. His son was out there, and finally, after all those years of pain and uncertainty, Alexander was closer than ever to bringing him home. The trip to Europe was marked by a mix of anxiety and hope that Alexander had never experienced before. Each kilometer brought him closer to a moment he had dreamed of during all those years of suffering and doubt. The information provided by Sister Agnes was accurate, leading him to a picturesque small town in the French countryside, where the green hills stretched as far as the eye could see, and the pace of life was calm, almost unchanging. The address took him to a country house, surrounded by well-kept gardens, with flowers in full bloom and tall trees providing generous shade. The place seemed to be the opposite of everything Hollow Creek represented, a perfect antithesis to the darkness and mystery Alexander had faced to get there. But no matter how peaceful the setting was, the storm inside Alexander was only growing stronger. He stopped in front of the house, his hand hovering for a moment over the doorbell, hesitating. What would this meeting be like? How would he explain to Ethan, now a young man with a completely new life, everything that had happened? And more importantly, how would Ethan react? These questions tormented him, but he knew he couldn't turn back. He needed to see his son. He needed to feel the touch of the truth that was so close. Finally, he pressed the doorbell. The sound resonated softly in the air, and the seconds that followed felt like an eternity. Then the door opened and a woman appeared, her welcoming smile quickly transforming into a look of curiosity as she saw Alexander. "Can I help you?" she asked, her French accent softening her words. Alexander cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "My name is Alexander. I'm looking for Ethan." The words came out haltingly, laden with years of hope and fear. The woman's smile faltered for a moment, but then she nodded, as if she understood something deep and inevitable. "Yes, he is here. Please, come in." She led him down a hallway decorated with family photos, happy moments frozen in time. Alexander could hardly focus on the images as his footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. Each step brought him closer to a long-awaited meeting, yet he felt as if he were walking in a dream. Finally, the woman brought him to a small office with a large window that let in golden sunlight. There, sitting at a desk, was a young man with wavy brown hair, broad shoulders, and a posture that revealed a mix of confidence and calm. He was leaning over a book, but when he heard the door open, he looked up. Alexander stopped at the entrance, unable to move as he gazed at his son's face, now a young man, different from the boy he remembered, yet unmistakably Ethan. The world seemed to narrow around him, and for a moment, all that existed was the look of surprise in Ethan's eyes. "Ethan," the word slipped from Alexander's lips before he could stop it, filled with all the love, regret, and longing that had accumulated over the years. The young man furrowed his brow, confused, before speaking in a voice that was both familiar and strange to Alexander. "I'm sorry, I think you must be mistaken. My name is Mathieu." Alexander's heart tightened. "No, you are Ethan, my son." The words came out with an urgency he couldn't control. "I am your father." The confusion in Ethan's eyes transformed into a whirlwind of emotions. He slowly stood up, as if Alexander's words were a heavy burden to bear immediately. "My father? How is that possible? Mathieu has always been my name. I was adopted when I was very young. I don't remember anything before that." Alexander took a step forward, the need to explain everything overflowing. "There was an accident, terrible circumstances that separated us. I've searched for you for so long, and finally I found you." Mathieu Ethan looked at him, the internal conflict clearly visible on his face. "I don't know what to say. My whole life, I thought this was my family. How can I understand this now? How can I believe that everything I thought was true isn't?" Alexander felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I know it's a lot to accept. I don't expect you to understand everything right now, but I'm here. I never stopped looking for you. All I want is the chance to know you, to try to reconnect what we lost." There was a heavy silence where only their breathing could be heard. Then Mathieu Ethan took a hesitant step toward Alexander, his eyes still filled with uncertainty, but also with curiosity and a desire to understand. "I don't know if I can just accept this, but maybe we can try." Alexander nodded, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. "We can take it slow. We can figure this out together." They stood there looking at each other, trying to begin building a bridge over the years of separation. over the lives that had unfolded in such different paths. It was just the beginning of a new journey, a journey of reconciliation, healing, and discovery. But for Alexander, this moment, this connection, was everything he had dreamed of during all those years of searching and pain. And as they began to talk, trying to find a way forward, he knew that despite everything, there was hope. This long-awaited reunion was just the first step toward a new life together. What would you do in Alexander's place? Would you have the courage to uncover this case even knowing the risks? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this one.